Life Audio.
The Mama Take Heart podcast with Sabrina Rettle is brought to you by Life Audio and is a part of our Faith Toolkit series. For more inspirational, faith-affirming podcasts, visit lifeaudio.com.
You're listening to Mama Take Heart, Understanding Your Gen Z Girl, a show designed to help you be the compassionate, gospel-centered, and influential voice in your girl's life. I'm your host, Sabrina Rettle. Today's guest is Ashley Abercrombie. Ashley is a speaker and writer whose work and life has been featured in various magazines and digital outlets, including Darling, OprahMag.com, Relevant, and Grit and Virtue. She is the author of Rise of the Truth Teller, Own Your Story, Tell It Like It Is, and Live with Holy Gumption. And her latest book, which will be the focus of today's conversation, is Love is the Resistance. Learn to disagree, resolve the conflicts you've been avoiding, and create real change. Her YouVersion devotional, Finding God in Hard Places, has been completed by over 250,000 people. Ashley is a co-host alongside with Tiffany Bloom of the hilarious and helpful podcast, Why Though? I was drawn to your book, Love is the Resistance, and the subtitle is Learn to Disagree, Resolve the Conflicts You've Been Avoiding, and Create Real Change. And as we know, Gen Z, they're an action-oriented generation. And so for them, that is their purpose right now, is creating change. And they're social justice warriors. I just kind of wanted to talk about how we can not just relate to Gen Z in that aspect, but how we can show examples, be a model for them in that way. So I wanted to talk about your book. When you did the introduction, you talked about kind of how the church itself right now, we are kind of in a quandary. You know, there's a lot of different sides and a lot of opinions. So talk to me about how you came to write the book, Love is the Resistance.
Okay, so I love the two things that you said here about Gen Z. So I want to start there, and then I'll explain why I ended up writing this book that I love and I feel very proud of. I was raised in the church by my great-great-aunt Fairy. She was the only other Christian who was in my family, and we went to a very tiny church, like 70 people on a good day. And every Sunday after church, we would make pimento cheese sandwiches. We would cut flowers from her garden, and then we would walk the neighborhood and we would drop off food and we would drop off flowers, and we'd sit with people who were in our tradition called the sick and the shut-ins. You know, they were very sick and couldn't leave the house or shut up in the house for whatever reason. Maybe they're healing and recovery, elderly. And so we would go and visit. And so my faith from a young age was always deeply connected to the things that I do. So my faith has felt so much bigger always than just a Sunday service. And it has felt deeply connected to the neighborhood since I was a little girl. And not that we live in a world anymore where you're necessarily going to walk the neighborhood, but we do live in a world where, we have responsibility to see each other, and we have an opportunity daily to make a difference, to see people, to see where they're at, to care for them. And so I think that for me, this idea of justice, this idea of neighborliness, this idea of God's love in action through us and in us has always been so formative to my faith. And when it came to writing Love is the Resistance, I had finished my last book, my first book, Rise of the Truth Teller. I ended the last 3 chapters on some themes about justice. Racial justice, talking about the criminal justice system. What is it? What's a way forward for us? How do we begin to understand the issues of our world? And then I sort of watched over the last couple of years, as the rest of us have, if you're listening from around the world, you've been watching America. If you live here, you are absolutely aware of all the conflict and the strife and the division and the polarizing narratives and the echo chambers that we're creating digitally and even in real life. People are doubling down, pushing into their camps, fractioning off. And so I looked at that and saw, man, I do not see Jesus in any of this. And the other real conviction that I carry is that God really told me, like, hey, you like to talk to people who think like you. And you like to, demonize and villainize the other side if they're doing something that you feel is hurtful or harmful. And I felt like the Lord really took me on a journey of what it means to have mercy and his heart for people, that he loves the other side. And so as I'm writing this idea of love is the resistance, and especially because I'm a fan of getting in the streets, like the Gen Z, I'm out there, we're going to march with our kids. We're going to be out in the streets. And at the same time, God was like, who are you talking to? Because if you don't communicate to everyone where they can hear you and actually have some tangible change, then real change will never really happen. And so I felt very challenged by God to better understand what it means to have love as resistance. And what does it mean to march, but to also encourage people to come this way, to understand justice, and I don't mean come this way, like come join my political agenda here, but I mean like, hey, come the way of love. Understand mercy, understand patience in a world that is hurried and always on to the next thing. Understand what it means to be kind in a world where people are loving, talking down to one another and being prideful. Come learn what it means to not be jealous, to not be boastful, to not be prideful. Come learn what it means, the way of love. And that is why I wrote this book, is because I felt deeply convicted that we needed a better, more faithful witness to the world from the church, the collective, the body of Christ. And I wanted people to also personally experience freedom in relationships when it comes to things like conflict and tension. We just don't do it well.
I do think that we have a problem sometimes as Christians as holding the tension.
Yes.
So the good and the bad, and what God's going to do with all of it, and how to set in all of it, and not trying to force another way, but to see what God's going to do in the tension of things. And so let's talk about how you spoke on the conflict part, and how we can have conversations that we may not agree with the person, but how we can still lovingly have that conversation. It doesn't mean that you have to coddle a person. I mean, you can have a conviction without it becoming a personal attack. And I think that's the problem.
Gosh, you are spot on. I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I have 18 years of recovery this year from, abuse of alcohol and drug addiction, eating disorders, perfectionism, and dysfunctional relationships. I know that's a long list, but I tell it because there are people listening who can really relate to these things. And it is different when you are disagreeing with someone who's in your household, like your Gen Z child, or when you are disagreeing with maybe someone who's at your job at the water cooler, y'all are talking about some kind of social justice issue or a politics or religion or something that comes up, or a family member who's extended at the holidays. Like all these conversations around conflict look different pending the relationship. But what I've noticed in my years of recovery and what I've really learned is how to become a safe person. And there is something called differentiation. And I talk about some of this in the book, but differentiation being this tension between us. So there is a space that says, I can own what I want, what I think, what I need, and what I feel. And I can tolerate another person doing the same. And I feel like we've gotten to this place where we cannot do that. It's like if another person shares from a different perspective because of their background or their upbringing or where they come from. And I'm not talking about hurtful or harmful language. That needs to be called out, and it's not okay. If you're going to speak, with racism in your tone, or you're going to speak with, with sexist undertones, like none of that is okay. So let's just call that's just a no, hard pass. But at the same time, when somebody disagrees with you or they see things from another perspective, it's important that we can hold that tension of, hey, this is where I end and that's where they begin. This is what I think, need, and feel. And that's what they think, need, and feel. And I'm going to hold the space for that. And I'm not going to try to fix them. I'm not going to try to correct them. I'm not going to try to advise them. I'm not going to try to convince them to come my way and to think the way that I think. And I think because we've lost that art of sort of holding tension and space with one another, and we've lost the idea of good boundaries and being a safe person, who can understand people, I think that has created a great deal of unnecessary conflict between us. And then because we don't like conflict, we do one of two things. We sweep it under the rug and pretend like it's not there, or just don't deal with it, or sort of smile and keep it moving, or we react very aggressively and we have, lots of thoughts and lots of things to say, and we communicate, in a way that could be disrespectful. And both of those ends, and I've done both, depending the relationship, but both of those ends, what they're both doing is avoiding conflict and tension. And what they are both doing is avoiding the intimacy and the potential for connection that comes when you just let something be. And to your point, to sit in that tension and sit with it and ask more questions and become curious instead of becoming angry. How did you arrive at that conclusion? What have you been thinking about that helped you get here? Can you help me better understand your perspective? Can you tell me about your upbringing? Because I think mine was different and I don't see it the same way. Can we talk about that? Like, these are curious questions. These are open questions. This is a posture of generosity instead of shutting down, or shutting down the other person. And I think that we really have to return to this place where we can have healthier boundaries and healthier ways of speaking and healthier ways of holding tension and healthier ways of letting people be. We're not the moral police of the universe. Like, quit that.
Truly, only Jesus can change another person's heart.
Yes.
What I find is, yes, you are correct to ask questions of curiosity instead of critique, and to just try. And also that person will allow you to express how you feel, but not in a fit of rage. And I think that's part of the issue, because once we get to that level, no one's listening to anyone. We're just trying to one up each other, overshout each other. And that's the example that we want to set for our children, that we want them to engage the world that way. Is that the example that Jesus gave us? And so, yes, I agree wholeheartedly of that you can have your conviction, and maybe in expressing something, the other person may think about what you're saying, but in that also be praying for that person. We need to pray for each other. And so, but yeah, I agree wholeheartedly on that. But, I do like to talk to people that I don't necessarily agree with. And I do ask exactly those questions, because I am very curious. How did you at that perspective? Yes. And even if I don't agree with them, listening to how they arrived at the perspective helps me understand where they're coming from.
Yes.
So yeah, that's part of it right there. And that is how we want to talk to our children that way, because they're going to do things that we disagree with. But I want to understand, how did you get to this place of this decision? And, what is your perspective on it? Because there's things going on in the world that they're soaking in. And there's a lot happening in the world right now. And it's just hard to keep that constant stress.
Yes.
And so sometimes, their decision making is a result of that constant stress. And so, yes.
Right.
Yeah, just engaging them. And then I like the way chapter 3, when you talk about language matters, and you touched on that a little bit. We were just talking about certain language, sexism or a misogynistic language, racist language. Talk a little bit more about that. Why does language matter? Right.
So, I'm sure that you've probably heard a phrase like this. I don't know who originally coined it, but just our words shape our world. So the things that we speak become the things that we live. And which is sort of what scares me about the world that we're living in, because we have this, phone, a little computer in our hand all the time. The average adult spends 2 to 4 hours a day on social media, and 2 of those hours are on Facebook. And so I think about all of that is forming the way we think. It is actually shaping our mind. It is actually, changing our perspective. It is teaching us how to think about ourselves, about others, about the world, about God. And so I think why this is important is because we need to recognize, what is pastoring me? It's the question I like to ask people. And, and for those who maybe having a difficult time with church right now, I've been there. So this language is not to trigger you about pastoring, but to help you think, is the way of Jesus my biggest influence? Or is this world my biggest influence? Is Facebook or Instagram or Twitter my biggest influence? Is the news channels that I watch, are they on 24/7? Am I constantly taking them in? Am I beginning to regurgitate words that come from pundits and politicians and internet preachers more than I'm actually reflectively thinking about how I think about myself, God, and others? And so this idea of language matters is so important to me, because the way that we are shaped The way that we think becomes the way that we speak, and that becomes the way that we live, and that becomes the way that we relate to others. So as an example, if you were raised thinking that a particular people group is scary, or that they shouldn't be here, or that they, are this, that, or the other thing, and you do not do adult, mature work to undo those things that you learned, you will carry that into your life. You will pass it on to your children. It will come out in sideways comments. You will continue to consume news or media that confirms what you think, instead of actually sitting and going, wait a minute, why do I think what I think? You know what? It's because I heard so-and-so say this all the time. But is that actually true? Is that actually what God thinks about this person or this people group? And that's important for us to do this hard soul work, because again, language matters, and we grow up learning it. We take it in at school. We take it in our family of origin. We take it in our faith communities. And I've had to constantly, as an adult, do the hard work of asking God, why do I do what I do? Why do I think what I think? And God, does it line up with what you think? Does it line up, God, with what you care about? Does it line up with God? Does it line up, God, with what you say about the people that you've created? Because if you truly made everyone in your image, and I can't see that, you're not broken. The Bible's not broken. Something's going on with me. I have a perspective that doesn't match God's. And so it's just important for us to mature and do that work. And I think it really starts with language, and you figure out your language by figuring out, what are you meditating on? What are you taking in all the time? What are you consuming? Who are you listening to? And you can have voices living in your head from 20 years ago, right? So you could still have those things playing in your mind, and they affect how you live. They affect how you relate, and that deeply impacts our relationships.
I do like the way your book is set up also. So talk to us about how each chapter is constructed and why you constructed it that way.
So each chapter is, I write each chapter with a theme in mind, something I hope to teach or share, or help us learn and grow, help us think thoughtfully or reflectively. And some of it will feel challenging to you, and some of it will feel, frustrating. I've gotten this feedback from people. They love it. So much of it is hopeful, but there's also moments that you're challenged and frustrated. And at the end of every chapter, I took the time to write out 4 things that you can do, because I don't want to just talk about love and what it is and how it can be resistance, but I actually want us to live it and practice it. And so I give us an attitude to adopt at the end, an affirmation that we can speak, a thoughtful, reflective question, like the one I just asked, why do I do what I do? And then, a prayer that we can have to take away. And I think that that's really important for us to be able to actually practice the things that we're reading about. There's so much of our world we're consuming all the time. You guys are just consume. And I'm guilty of it too. And I think about Solomon, King Solomon, he was a greedy man. We don't learn about him this way, but he was a very greedy man, and he would hoard information. He would hoard wealth. He hoarded people. He hoarded women. He was very, very greedy. And so because of this, we can't just store up knowledge and be satisfied just consuming it. We actually have to let knowledge become understanding, because understanding leads to wisdom. And wisdom you can actually apply and live. And so that is my hope for this book, is that there are things that you could take away and actually live.
Yes, I like that. What I thought was interesting is on one of the techniques where you talk about being contemplative with the Lord, almost like contemplative prayer, sitting in silence. And you said to set a timer for 10 minutes, to sit in silence and just listen to what the Lord is saying to you. And that is something I think we do not do enough of. We are so into just talking or not listening to the Lord, but just talking to the Lord. And so there's sometimes he's trying to speak to us, but we can't hear him over our own voice.
True.
So yeah, I did appreciate that, because when I first started contemplative prayer, it was difficult because it's
so hard.
Yes. And then you have all these other things going on in your head. So it's hard to quiet your mind. Yes. And so, but I agree. And if you can't do 10 minutes at a time, start with 2 minutes, just inch your way into it. But to me, that is such a way to grow in your faith and to grow with the Lord and really hear him
Yes.
over the voices in the world.
Yeah. And that also teaches you, I think, patience. The more on the days where I'm able to practice this, the less reactive I am to my children. I realize that I can actually hold greater space. I don't feel like mom rage coming to the surface, which is a very real struggle for me personally. I know that's not every mom's story. Anger is certainly mine.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel less like I want to go into control mode. I feel like I'm a little bit freer to love them, to be open, to hold space, to ask questions, to get curious, like you were talking about earlier with your kids. And when I'm slower paced and when I'm more contemplative and thoughtful and reflective, I find myself leaning into that with my children in an easier way.
Wow, that's great. Well, thank you for talking about your mom rage.
It's real.
It is real.
Yeah.
I think that people need to hear that, you know, struggle. All moms have struggles. Every single one of them.
Correct.
For those of you who think I don't have struggle, think again.
Exactly. I'm with you.
But anyway, and if I have put myself across that way, I apologize. That is not my intent. So, but anyway, I do appreciate your candor and just your way of introducing how we can make love the resistance, and that we can, like a few of your chapters, you talk about love thy neighbor and learning love and autonomy from our camp, because sometimes some feel like what we are having as a witness is really, that's not who I am. And so, yeah, I think this is a great conversation. And I hope that the mamas here can learn a little bit, just have some contemplative time with it and think it through. But as we know, Gen Z, they're watching us and they're learning from us. And we want to be the best example of Christ that we can be authentically. Because remember, they like authenticity.
Yes, they do.
Right. Okay, so I just want to thank you again, Ashley, for joining us today. And why don't you let our listeners know where they can find you?
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to have this conversation with you. And I love the work that you're doing with moms. We need it so desperately. So I thank you. And I spend probably the most of my time on Instagram. So I'm there at Abercrombie, and I'm on my website, ashaAbercrombie.org. There's resources, YouVersion Bible studies. There's all kinds of stuff over there that you could read or watch that I think might be a blessing to you guys. And it would be such a joy to connect with you.
Okay, and I will put all the ways to connect in the show notes. Remember, God is for you and you're not alone. With His Spirit, you are filled with courage and strength of purpose. So don't fret, Mama. Instead, take heart.
Mama Take Heart is a production of Life Audio and the Salem Web Network. If you liked what you just listened to, would you take a second and leave us a rating in your favorite podcast app? It really does help more people like you find our show. This podcast is produced by me, Kelly Givens, and Stephen Sanders, with executive oversight by Stephen McGarvey. You can find more podcasts like this over at lifeaudio.com.